Britt from Alabama is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to follow up on Senator Vance's line of questioning, Mrs. Calder, that he did not get to finish with time permitting. Last month, we had a subcommittee hearing about the federal strategic plan to prevent and end homelessness. Among other things, we were told that specifically from Biden administration housing policies, if you look at the Housing First initiatives and those policies, that they were working, and some of the people before us were advocating for those. But in an article that you wrote in February of this year, you suggested that these same policies with a hefty price tag often do not accomplish the goal of combating homelessness. In fact, you stated that the year that California implemented the Housing First statewide, from 2016 to 2022, chronic homelessness actually increased by 93%. Mrs. Calder, in your opinion, has the Housing First strategy been successful enough to justify the hefty price tag?
So I would say no in general. Now, I think, earlier Diane mentioned that Housing First, it just works. The research just says that it works. I think we have to be really careful about what do we mean by works? If we mean by ends chronic homelessness, if we mean reduces chronic homelessness, this is what most people think of when they think of Housing First working or a homeless policy working. Now, does it end homelessness for some of the beneficiaries, for the beneficiaries that receive those permanent housing subsidies? I think you can argue that yes, for them it does. But in terms of big picture, is it reducing the number of homeless people, the number of chronically homeless people? That's the group that it targets specifically. The answer, at least in two of the places that it's been adopted, is resoundingly no, based on the data. In Utah is actually the first place to adopt Housing First back in 2005. And in Utah, homelessness has increased by 93%. You mentioned California, where it's increased by 95%. In Houston, Texas, we have a little bit of a different situation where actually they adopted, so adding some nuance into the conversation, they've adopted Housing First, and actually they have reduced homelessness there. I think that Houston is a pretty unique situation. Houston has a variety of different things going for it, one of which is that it lacks a traditional zoning code, has a very pro-development culture, has a very responsive housing supply. We know that zoning regulations, having relatively more zoning regulations, is associated with having a greater degree of homelessness. So I think that that's something that other places could look at as something that would bolster their efforts at rental assistance and at homeless policy.
Earlier this year, we had economist Dr. Diaz, and he discussed the regulatory burden in home building before this very committee. According to the National Association of Home Builders, over 40% of multifamily development costs come from government regulations. If one of our goals here is to increase housing affordability, then the answer seems clear. We have to fix the overly burdensome regulatory environment. Would you agree?
Absolutely, yes.
Can you briefly discuss some of the land use regulatory obstacles and how they're affecting housing prices, please?
Yes, there are so many obstacles. Honestly, it is such a pervasive problem. I think most people really don't know. I studied urban planning for my undergraduate degree, so I'm very familiar with all of the various urban land use and zoning regulations that affect development. They affect every element of development. They're some of the worst from a housing supply perspective. Regulations are things like minimum lot sizes. In some places, these require that homeowners buy lots that are 1 acre or 2 acres or more even. Obviously, that's not going to be affordable if you want to put down a tiny home or a little modular unit or something. That is going to undercut the economics of doing something like that. There are also things like parking regulations that really push up the cost of rent. There was a study that found that parking requirements push up the cost of rent by 17% for renters. That's a really significant regulation as well. But anything that relates to density, that limits density, certainly just broad single-family home zoning that doesn't allow anything but single-family homes to be built is something that limits density very restrictively. And so that's something that a lot of states and local governments are looking at reforming now.
Thank you.
Thanks, Senator Britt. Senator Van Hollen of Maryland's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank all of you for your testimony.